Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights.
Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. Today's topic is about injustice, wrongful convictions, and those who have suffered from them, what has happened to their lives. Along with that topic, we're going to be joined by Jason Flom. He is another podcaster. He's an author, a journalist, and he is a wrongful conviction and injustice advocate. And he has started this particular podcast called Lava for Good. So we want to get some really important things out there. One, I want to ask him about how he got started doing it and why he actually started doing this work on wrongful convictions. And he has actually been successful in helping a few people get their conviction overturned because the evidence just simply did not support the rulings that happened in the court. It didn't support what happened in the courtroom, and it didn't support the fact that these people were convicted, and in a lot of cases he has gotten some people fully exonerated from the charges themselves. So let's welcome to the show Jason Flom with Lava for Good.
Hi, this is Gilbert King. I'm glad so many of you have found Leo Schofield's case as compelling as Kelsey and I do. You may also be interested to know that there are thousands of cases like Leo's in the U.S., and that Lava for Good, the company I worked with to create Bone Valley, is deeply invested in telling these stories. In fact, Jason Flom is the founding board member of the Innocence Project, and he hosts another Lava for Good podcast called Wrongful Conviction. Wrongful Conviction features intimate conversations with men and women who have spent years in prison for crimes they did not commit. In addition to Jason, Wrongful Conviction is also hosted by Pulitzer Prize-winning podcast host Maggie Freeling, and currently there's a series running of guest-hosted episodes, including one with yours truly. So if you are as disturbed as we are about Leo's story, please search, find, and follow Wrongful Conviction anywhere you listen to podcasts.
That is true. Everything you just said is true.
So, anyway, so I want to start the interview off with you telling the story about how you actually got started with that and what inspired it. So,
It started with my podcast, Wrongful Conviction, which was originally called Wrongful Conviction with Jason Flom. It's just called Wrongful Conviction now, singular, by the way. And I started that in 2016 because after having spent my entire adult life working on so many different aspects of criminal justice reform, and having had, especially, over the past decade or two, a real serious focus on wrongful conviction cases through my work with the Innocence Project. I thought if we could tell these human stories, I was inspired by Spielberg and what he did with the Holocaust survivors, right, where he created a permanent, lasting tribute and memorial to their suffering, their experiences, and that people will be able to study for hundreds of years. And, I thought in a contemporary version of that, we have these cases happening in real time right now. These people who are going through, I don't want to make any kind of, a comparison between the two, but the suffering that's endured by the people in our criminal legal system, by conservative estimates, there's over 100,000 innocent people sitting in a cage right now while you and I are talking. Like, the idea that we could put some meaning to that suffering and educate the public and change hearts and minds so that they aren't so quick, if they serve on a jury, to vote guilty just because they're being fed a stream of information that may or may not be true.
Well, one of the things that if you ask the general public is like, well, if the police arrested him, he must be guilty. That's one of the things that I think that's a starting point, but we need to change that view in the public that that can be flawed. They can arrest the wrong person.
It happens all day, every day, and twice on Sunday all over this country, and not just in America, but particularly in America. The problem is particularly acute in America because we just have this mass incarceration problem, which leads to the idea that around 11 million people cycle in and out of our jails and prisons every year. There's no possibility of getting justice when the system is completely and totally overloaded, even if everybody was doing their level best, which they're not. So, not to say there aren't some people who are, because there are, but there are a lot of people who are in this because, they want to advance themselves in the world, and whether or not they have to trample on people's civil rights to do it, or whether they have to get, just close cases because they have a saying, a body for a body, right? There's a dead body. We just got to pin it on somebody and keep it moving. And so a very large percentage of arrests and convictions are to the wrong people. And of course, when you arrest the wrong person and prosecute and persecute and imprison that person, the person who actually committed the crime remains free almost by definition. So it's a public safety issue as well that, we should demand better from our police and prosecutors and judges, and we have the ability to, at least in the case of prosecutors and judges, to vote. And many of them are elected officials. And so that's just something that I always harp on,
Well, yeah. I listened to one of the episodes, and I'm sorry, the names always seem to escape me, especially when when it really counts.
Right.
But I guess he also works with you, or works on the same project as you do, and he was arrested by way of somebody just happened to see him on a regular basis, and it eventually he got exonerated as part of his story, but when he was first questioned by the police, that when they checked out his story, at first he was in the wrong part of town and could never have been in the same house where the murders happened, and yet he got convicted.
Listen, the awful truth is that this happens all the time, and it's, we're 17 episodes in or something like that, and we haven't even scratched the surface of the tip of the iceberg, right? It's such a monumental problem, but every one of these is a tragedy, is a human tragedy, right? And of course, every one of these people has a family that loves them, and, it suffers along with them. And the fact is, we have cases that we've covered on the Wrongful Conviction podcast, like Nelson Serrano, right, who was in Atlanta when the quadruple murder happened in Central Florida. Provably so. And they knew it, but it didn't matter. They pinned it on him anyway. And you have the case of Pedro Reynoso. You're not even ready for this one. Pedro was in the Dominican Republic when the double murder happened in Philadelphia that he was convicted of. And he wasn't convicted of planning it or being an accessory. He was convicted of being the shooter. But he was in the Dominican Republic. He had timestamped video. He was at his son's baptism that day. There was 12 witnesses, including a priest. There was travel documents and passport stamps. And somehow or other, because he was indigent, they were able to convict him anyway. He remains in prison to this day, 30 years later, suffering, through bouts of cancer, and he's had a perfect record in prison too. And the same is true with Temujin Kensu, Temujin, I should say, Temujin Kensu, case I'm obsessed with in Michigan, where Temujin has been in for 36 years for a crime that happened when he was 400 miles away, and they figured out a way around that. They claimed he chartered a private jet at 2:00 in the morning with money that he didn't have. He was on food stamps. You know what I mean? It's like the whole thing is like, are you kidding me? But it would be funny, except it's so freaking sick. And of course, the real murderer remained free in these different cases.
And see, that's one of the points, is the real murderer gets to go free and kill again.
Correct. And in many cases, that's exactly what happens. And, we now have the new podcast series out, Bone Valley, on Lava for Good, which has been on, the top 10 in, 25 different countries, including the U.S., and is really catching on and making an impact. Yeah. And I'm so glad, because that's one of those cases where, Leo Schofield has been in for...
Leo Schofield, he's in Florida, right?
He's in Florida, yeah. He's in a Florida prison now. Well,
we shared. There's a journalist, Gilbert.
Gilbert King.
Gilbert King, yeah. We had him on our show. It was I think we actually aired the episode just after you guys aired your episode on Bone Valley, and some of the things that in this particular instance, though, he said that he got the tip-off from a judge.
It's really an incredible thing, and I'm glad you brought that up. I hope if you can splice it in, maybe you can even play the first 60 seconds of the Bone Valley podcast on your podcast, because it's so powerful, because it opens with Gilbert, who's got a wonderful voice. And he says, Gilbert is the investigative journalist, and he says, who's a Pulitzer Prize winner, by the way. And, he says something like, in all your years of doing this, did you ever think you'd find yourself advocating for someone who claims they're innocent? And then you hear this real deep voice guy who sounds like a judge. And he's a sitting circuit court judge. And he just goes, no. In fact, a lot of people have told me I'm really out over my skis right now. And he says, I'm not allowed. I'm not supposed to be doing this. And Gilbert says, yeah, this is the voice of Judge Scott Cupp, and he's not allowed to make comments on pending cases at all. But here he is speaking to me, a journalist, and he's risking not only his seat on the circuit court, but also he could be disbarred. And the judge goes on to say, look, I can't leave it alone. I just can't leave it alone. So what?
You've been around the system for a long time. Could you ever imagine the day where you'd sit at a table with a microphone and vouch for a man who says he's not guilty?
No. In fact, I've stated many times I'm probably way over my skis right now. Technically, I'm not supposed to be doing this. But it's like, if I don't do it, who the fuck's gonna do it?
This is Judge Scott Cupp. He isn't supposed to make any public comments on pending cases, at all. Florida's Code of Judicial Conduct prohibits it. And yet, that's exactly what he's doing, to me, a writer. This could cost him not only a seat on the 20th Circuit Court, he could even be disbarred.
I just can't let it go.
What does that tell you? And this is not a lefty guy, this Judge Scott Cupp. He's a guy who's, had a long career, mostly as a prosecutor, like most judges. I think it's important for everyone to recognize that over 80% of judges are former prosecutors. It's one of the things that I believe makes our system, unfair. I've really been thinking a lot lately about, the scales of justice, right? And how, we've all seen that remarkable image.
Yeah.
There's no accuracy in that, unfortunately. Yeah. It really should look like a seesaw where one side's all the way on the ground.
Well, you brought up something interesting, and you said that the one guy that was convicted, he was 400 miles away. They claimed that he chartered a jet with money he didn't have because he was on food stamps. Well, a guy that's on food stamps doesn't have money to go hire a lawyer to fight back.
No, you're absolutely right, and I'm glad you brought that up. And by the way, I don't even know if he was necessarily on food stamps, but he was living on the margins, living in a trailer. It was back, behind in his things. Had even gone so far as to pass a bad check when he couldn't afford food. I mean, he was really living on the margins. And they claimed that he went to an airstrip at 2-something in the morning in a remote part of Michigan, found a pilot who was willing to fly him while not, he couldn't have paid him, so he must have just been dying to do a 800-mile round trip for free while also not registering any flight logs, right? So risking his pilot's license and everything else. I think the FAA frowns on that sort of activity, right?
Yeah.
And this guy was going to fly him there, and then he was going to go find this kid who he killed. This kid who was tragically murdered, who was roaming around a campus that he would have had no idea that he was there or how to find him or if he was there or when there was no Google back then. We're talking about the 80s. So, but anyway, to your point, Michael, the attorney that was assigned to him was also the attorney for the lead detective in the case who had some sort of drug charges pending. This attorney was witnessed going in and out of crack houses 19 times and was subsequently disbarred. And that's just the beginning of the problems with this attorney. This attorney was so compromised, and I believe that the powers that be were pretty specific in choosing him to represent Mr. Kenzu because they knew that he had a 0% chance of mounting any sort of a defense because this guy was so troubled in so many ways, including with his drug issues and his compromised, his priorities were totally compromised, right? He was working on both sides of the fence. So that was just one of the millions of things that went wrong in this case that led to his wrongful conviction.
When we talk about the money, I'm not going to mention the celebrity's name. Everybody's going to know who I'm talking about when I talk about the case in Philadelphia where it was a rape situation, multiple rapes. He was convicted via a testimony, an affidavit that he gave in a lawsuit that was filed against him, and was told that, oh, don't worry about it, this will never hit the prosecutor's office. It hit the prosecutor's office. He was tried, convicted, and then on the rear end, he gets back out of jail again because he is able to mount enough money in dollars to pay enough lawyers so that they get him off. But he had money and he was a celebrity. So how does that, when we talk about our balance and scales of justice, how does that weigh out?
Well, listen, that's something I'm focused on at this moment in the sense of I have recently been involved in some cases where I got connected to these cases before the trials. So before the wrongful convictions could have and probably would have happened. One was a case of 3 kids in the southern state, 3 black teenagers who went to buy, my understanding is, a dime bag of weed from a white guy who was a much older guy. They met him on a local sports field. He took their money and didn't give them the weed. And I think one of them threw a punch at him, and that was the end of that. And he called the cops on them claimed that they had robbed him at gunpoint, and they were all arrested and looking at 15 years to life in prison. And I was able to get involved in the most basic way. I hired an investigator who was successful in finding videotape from the sports complex or wherever it was, some sort of athletic thing. There was video. It was very grainy. He was able to enhance it. We were able to bring that to the prosecutor and show them that there never was a gun. There was no crime committed whatsoever, except you could say by this guy who stole their money. But he was white and they were black, and it was the South, and etc. But at the end of the day, the prosecutor, faced with this evidence that probably never would have been found or come to light had not a competent investigator or an excellent investigator. He did an excellent job. I don't know the guy. But he found this evidence, and the charges were reduced to probation. So the kids took a plea. They could have taken their chances and gone to trial, but I support their decision. But they're not going to jail, and that's a great result. And by virtue of, I can tell you on the air here, it was $10,000, best $10,000 I've ever spent in my life. You know what I mean? And for that amount of money, $3,300 per kid, we were able to prevent this disastrous outcome from almost certainly befalling them. And I recently was just yesterday got some good news on another case I've been working on where there's a shaken baby case, and I was able to get experts who did a deep dive into this evidence, and when presented with these findings that were absolutely crystal clear, like even to a layman like me, I could read these reports from these experts, these doctors, these scientists, and see that nothing happened to this child. And shaken baby syndrome, by the way, is a myth. And the fact is, there's a big case going on in New Jersey right now where a very courageous judge refused to allow that nonsensical hypothesis into his courtroom. And so, the state is appealing that ruling, and we are fighting back against that because shaken baby needs to be abolished from the lexicon. It should never be spoken in a courtroom again. It shouldn't be spoken in a hospital. It's fucking nonsense. And the good news is, in this particular case, we were able once again to prevent this grieving mother from going to prison, potentially for the rest of her life, for a crime that never happened. Nothing was done to this poor child. The child had a pre-existing condition that led to a brain bleed that led to his very untimely death.
Yeah, that's a tragic situation, and my heart goes out to a mother that loses a child, or a father who loses a child to a condition like that. Because brain bleed, there's nothing any of the emergency room surgeons or any of them can actually do in that case. Yeah.
No, and the problem is that these. The system is so flawed straight through, right? The hospitals are incentivized to report anything. In fact, they're required to report anything that they think there's an iota of a chance that there was abuse involved to the authorities. And once they do, then, the downhill slide begins. And, it insulates them in many cases, my understanding is, from potential liability for mistakes that they may have made in the treatment of the child or whomever it is. Child, we're talking about specifically these kind of cases. So it's just messed up all the way down the road. But if you get a chance, listen to, we have the Wrongful Conviction podcast. We did a series called Wrongful Conviction Junk Science, hosted by a very brilliant legal mind, lawyer named Josh Dubin, who has made a specialty out of junk science cases. And so listen to that episode on shaken baby syndrome. Also, there's a fantastic book called Junk Science by Chris Fabricant of the Innocence Project. He's a strategic litigation director at the Innocence Project. I'm going to give you the full title. Let me just look it up real quick. But I couldn't recommend this book more highly. It reads like a novel. It's not a textbook. But it has a ton of information. I learned a lot listening to it. I learned a lot reading it. It's called Junk Science and the American Criminal Justice System by Chris Fabricant. That's Fabricant. Get it today.
All right. Well, make sure we put that also in our show notes so people can find it right away. Junk science and in the previous career, I was an analytical chemist, and you watch these shows like on CSI and stuff like that, and they say that they had these technical advisors come in to help them get the terminology right and the evidence handling right and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, well, who are these technical advisors did they have doing these shows? Because if that's actually who's running these forensics labs, we might have a problem. Because
Houston, we definitely have a problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, to use the old phrase from the space program.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the problem is that people trust what they see on these very popular shows on television, these dramas, right? The crime dramas, where the bad guy goes to jail. The good guys are the people in uniform, whether that's a lab coat or a blue uniform or a suit and tie, or even robes. And everybody goes to sleep happy that we're all safe and the situation, the case was solved. But one thing I think probably the most counterintuitive thing, and maybe it's scary for some people to consider, is that these junk sciences are foisted on juries by people with fancy degrees from medical schools and other places who don't actually know anything about what they're doing. And the medical examiners are often in line with the cops, been known to change their findings. Coroners, medical examiners, forensic pathologists. These people have some strange incentives, and none of them, at the end of the day, are objective. I think we'd all like to believe that they are. I used to believe that they are, or were. Yeah. But the fact is, there was an incredible study that was conducted recently where 130 medical examiners and forensic pathologists were given the same body of evidence of an actual case of a 3-year-old child who was brought to the hospital with a brain, problem of some sort. And this toddler died. And what they did is they separated these 130 professionals into groups of 65. The first group, they told them that the child was a white child brought into the hospital by a grandparent. And the second group, they told them that it was a black child who was brought to the hospital by the mother's boyfriend. And what do you know? With exactly the same evidence, the second group was 4 times more likely to rule it a homicide. 4 times. And their organizations fought the publication of this study. I'm sure they all thought they were going to come up aces in this, right? But the fact is, all of these quote-unquote sciences, with the exception of DNA, handled properly, of course,
yes,
are involve elements of subjectivity that are significant. And that includes fingerprints. Forget about these other junk sciences like bite mark evidence, blood spatter, arson. To become a blood spatter expert and be allowed to testify in court, you take a 40-hour course, which they mostly train you in acting. They mostly train you in this course about how to act like you know what you're talking about in a courtroom. There's no science behind that.
Yeah.
tire tread analysis, 911 call analysis, footprint analysis. There's just one after the other of these junk sciences that you just, you just think, how can this be? And how can it be, Michael? And I'll get off this rant in a second, but I often talk about how, in my view, science and law are opposite, because in science, they're constantly updating, right? New discoveries are made, textbooks are edited or rewritten, new practices are instituted for the good of all.
Right.
In the law, in courtrooms, and many people might be shocked to learn this, but the basic standard is, well, I see a judge in 1958 allowed this type of evidence into a courtroom, so I'm going to allow it too. Never mind the fact that it's been, discredited and proven to be like hair analysis, these other things proven to be complete junk science. They just say, well, it was good enough for another courtroom, it's good enough for me. And so it's still allowed, like bite mark analysis is still allowed in all 50 states, even though they can't even tell if it's a human bite mark or an animal bite mark in many cases.
Oh, yeah. With that being said, science is questioned all the time. As a matter of fact, in sciences, you're taught to question everything and keep questioning it, and that's how we keep updating things with science, right? Mm-hmm. In the legal professions, and I'm going to use myself as an example. For a contempt of court charge, in one of my divorces, I asked the judge how she came to the conclusion that she did. I just wanted to know what she saw that I couldn't see in front of me, and I was later escorted to the county jail for contempt of court because I asked a question of the judge. So you tell me, how is it that science is allowed to ask as many questions as you want? You go in a courtroom, you ask one lousy little question, and you're reprimanded and cuffed and thrown behind bars for a day.
You're reminding me, and yours is the, much, I don't want to say mundane, it's still a miserable experience, but you reminded me of a incredible scene in the 4th episode we ever recorded of the Wrongful Conviction podcast. We covered the incredible case of Sunny Jacobs in the state of Florida. She and her partner, Jesse Tefero, were sentenced to death. Jesse was in fact executed in a botched execution that led to the abolition of the electric chair as a means of capital punishment. His head caught on fire, and the whole thing was just grotesque. But anyway, they were both innocent. And she was, after 17 years, she was offered a plea as the case had completely collapsed. The only witness had recanted, et cetera, et cetera. And Sonny, who's about 5'1" and just still sort of a hippie, wears love beads and is just meditation and yoga and just this absolute most beautiful soul you could imagine. But she's tough. And she was in prison for 17 years, including 5 years on death row. So the condition of her plea that she was being allowed to take, and which would lead to her immediate release, was that she was not allowed to say a word in the courtroom. So there she is, and the prosecutor is going on and on about what a terrible miscarriage of justice this is, and she's this horrible murderer of 2 policemen, and the whole thing. He's just assassinating her character, and she's supposed to just sit there and take it. And Sonny being Sonny, she goes, "Your Honor." And everybody looks at her like, oh, what is she doing? And she goes, "Can I have a glass of water? Because I have a bad taste in my mouth." It's amazing, right? It's amazing. She was freed. She was freed anyway. The judge, I don't know. They didn't hold her to the same standard they held you apparently in that particular case. But I don't think you would have wanted to switch places with her either. But anyway, she's I hope you get a chance to meet her. She's just a magical person.
Well, it's a simple contempt of court thing where you wound up behind bars for just overnight, because the judge wanted to make a point. That's small.
That was divorce court?
Yeah, it was divorce court. That's small stuff in comparison to being convicted for murder, but it just points out the problem in the system is that there isn't any standard because you can't question anything. How do you question? How do you have a standard of justice that can't be questioned?
Yeah, I mean, and if you don't have proper representation, then those questions aren't going to get asked regardless. It's like, how do you do that? And, the system, it's so sad and scary how it not only processes so many innocent people into prison as if their lives truly don't matter. And as if public safety also truly doesn't matter. But also how so many of these bad actors, fight to maintain these wrongful convictions after they've been proven wrong. It's just, if I can tell one more quick story, we recently covered the case on the Wrongful Conviction podcast, an episode that was hosted by the great Laura Nyrider. She interviewed Vincent Ellerby, who at 14 years old was wrongfully convicted of a quadruple murder, even though his uncle had been a member of the homicide, had been a homicide detective in the area, and the murder, the two perpetrators were witnessed running out of the house by a police chaplain who lived across the street and heard the gunshots and ran out to see what was going on. So they knew it was two grown men, and he was a 14-year-old boy. They forced him into giving a false confession, which made no sense whatsoever. None of the facts matched anything to do with the case. Long story short, he was convicted and sentenced to, I think, 37 years to life. Well, 2 weeks after he was convicted, a local hitman named Vincent Smothers was arrested for 8 other murders. And he underwent some sort of an awakening, and he said to them, listen, by the way, that one over on Allen Street or whatever street it was that this horrible quadruple murder happened, he goes, that was me also. He goes, here's what I did, here's who I was with, here's where the guns are that I used in the crime, here's the type of guns that I used in the crime. He gave them everything. And he was a true hitman. I mean, this guy had killed, a lot of people. As the saying goes, he had killed more people than cancer in that area, right? And the fact is, he gave them all the information, and they buried it. And they fought tooth and nail to keep this kid in. It took 10 years for him to be finally freed, even though they knew, without any doubt. I mean, he told them where the guns were. They went and found the guns exactly where he said they were, that were used in the crime. His description of the scene was perfect. The conversation he had with one of only 2 survivors, as recounted by her, was also recounted by him. They didn't know each other. The whole thing was like literally cut and dried as it could be, and it was 2 weeks after he was convicted. Right then and there, the system should have righted itself, and they should have freed this kid instead of making him suffer. And I think he went to an adult prison because he was 15 in an adult prison. I mean, forget adult prison, juvenile prison. He didn't belong in any prison of any kind. It's just, but I get a little excited about this. Sorry if I just blew out somebody's earbuds as they're listening, as I start screaming into the microphone.
Yeah, but why? It's just amazing that that everybody else can be questioned about their work, but these lawyers.
Yeah, and then there's the issue of prosecutorial immunity and absolute immunity that they enjoy, and of course, police enjoy
Yeah.
qualified immunity.
Yeah.
And I know that the average IQ and education of your listeners is very high, so I'm not going to insult anybody's intelligence. I assume that most of the listeners know what that means. So, but if not, you can easily look it up. But it's a crazy thing, and until it changes, I don't believe there's going to be a lot of until we have until we replace these elected officials with people who actually care about justice as opposed to just chalking up wins.
Yeah,
it's not going to change.
That is a lot of it. I do have one other question though, and it revolves around profiling, and you brought up something where the study with the 130 forensic medical examiners, and 65 of them were told that it was a person of color or minority, and you said that the rate of homicide went up by about 4 times as many. Many of them would have ruled it as a murder because, hey, it was a black kid brought in by a black guy, as opposed to a white kid brought in by a white grandfather.
Correct.
And this whole profiling idea, how much does it actually play into the fact that, we're going to look for a person of color as the perpetrator, as opposed to a person of a Caucasian person?
Oh, I mean, it's a huge factor across the board. There have been these remarkable studies done recently where they've shown that people in their subconscious, because they show images that move too fast for you to see them, and then they ask people, was there a gun in that thing? And when the person in the picture is a black person, they're much more likely to say there was a gun in the picture, even though it's the same picture but with a different person or a different set of information. I'm garbling that a little bit, but basically, people are, and this is true for sadly true for civilians as well as police, and it's true for witnesses, and it's true for jurors, more likely to believe that a person of color is a violent person, which there's no evidence to support that, of course, than a white person. And then, it gets worse when it's cross-racial, right? And we know that with identifications, and eyewitness misidentifications are one of the leading causes of wrongful convictions. And even when people are doing their level best, the idea of being able to identify somebody when you're in a frantic, fight or flight situation, witnessing a violent crime or being the victim of a violent crime, all your synapses are firing, and I don't even know if that's the right word for it, but your adrenaline is racing, and our minds are not cameras, right? They are absolutely not cameras. So eyewitness identification, my thing is, if there's nothing else to go on, if there's no physical evidence to support it, you can't convict somebody just based on an eyewitness identification, least of all if it's cross-racial, because cross-racial identification is less accurate than guessing. And there have been some studies that have shown that eyewitness identification in the cases of violent crime, even in cases where the person is the same race, is still less accurate than guessing. And there's that famous experiment that was done, it's been done over and over again, where a professor in England did it, I think in the 1890s the first time, where he had somebody burst into his classroom, assault him, steal his briefcase, and run out, or whatever he did, right? And then he showed people pictures of the 5 suspects. Everyone in the class had witnessed this, up close and personal. And he showed everybody 5 pictures, just so they could pick out who the perpetrator was. The accuracy rate was 0, because everybody picked somebody, but the actual perpetrator wasn't in that lineup. So that tells you why it sounds counterintuitive, but eyewitness identification is less accurate than guessing, because often, the real purpose not even in the picture. So anyway, yeah, but you're absolutely right to point out race as a factor. It's something we need to do better.
Yeah.
We can't, we can't continue this way.
Yeah, it's not a matter of throwing down a race card. It's just something that we need to find more equality around. There's been lots of scientific studies that show that eyewitness testimony doesn't work, and in physics and stuff like that, it's like they don't go by what the eye sees; they go by what the instrument read. It's like for a reason, because we don't know what we actually are seeing. Our brain just says, "Oh, I have to say something because I need to save face."
How about that? Yeah, the science part of science.
Yeah.
We love the science part of science.
Yeah. So I don't know. Anyway, we're starting to run out of time. And
Maybe that's that. Maybe we should make that hat. Make science scientific again, right?
yeah,
That'd be great.
there we go. Yeah, let's do that. You mentioned there's 3 different podcasts or 2 podcasts. That you're doing?
Well,
Let's
we
get those
have
out there.
we have the Wrongful Conviction podcast, and then inside of that feed, there's Wrongful Conviction Junk Science and Wrongful Conviction False Confessions, which is hosted by Laura Nyrider and Steve Drizzen, of the Center for Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern University. And then we also have a show called Righteous Convictions, which is again part of that feed, and then there's the separate new show, which is an episodic series like Serial, if you like Serial or In the Dark or any of those wonderful, brilliant podcasts where they unravel a story over the course of a season. Bone Valley is that. So the other one is individual episodes, bite-sized. You can take 45 minutes in the gym anytime and hear a complete story or learn about a topic. Whereas Bone Valley is 9 episodes of this one insane case of Leo Schofield. And I'm telling you, like I said, if you can put the first 60 seconds on your show, do it, because I think once you hear those first 60 seconds, you're going to want to know more. And then every episode takes you deeper into this rabbit hole of rabid injustice.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for your time today. It's been great meeting you. I hope to have you back again with the updates on how you've actually helped people out. So that'd be
sounds like a plan. I enjoyed being with you. You're a good interviewer, and I'm excited to do it.
All right. Thank you again, everybody, for listening, and do please click on that subscribe button wherever it might be, either on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or even Spreaker. And we thank you for listening. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.